So good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight at the Stubblefield Institute for Civil Political Communications for this evening's community engagement conversation on the moderation of online hate speech. I think I've seen most of you at events before, but if you don't know me, my name is Ashley Hurst. I'm the director of the Stubblefield Institute here at Shepherd. Tonight's topic of the moderation of online hate speech could not be more timely. We are at a moment where the U.S. Supreme Court is debating the rights of states to regulate how large social media companies control content on their platforms, which brings up many issues involving free speech, the rights of private companies to make decisions regarding their own operations, and the role of social media in society. Our own West Virginia legislature considered a similar bill this past legislative session. The bill passed the West Virginia House, but was not picked up by the Senate. We are also in an election year where the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, and content intended to divide poses an unprecedented threat to our democracy. We are also in the midst of a broadband expansion that is giving West Virginia residents greater access to the internet, while also in a time where it is estimated that roughly half of adults have encountered hate speech or harassment online. I think you get the picture. And I'm assuming that since you have chosen to join us tonight, you are just as concerned as we are. Thank you for choosing to have this discussion with us. At the Stubblefield Institute, we believe that when differing viewpoints are respected and considered in ways that avoid labeling, alienation, and silencing, it can strengthen our nation's ability to solve problems. Tonight, we will explore various aspects of the moderation of online hate speech. I am sure that we will touch on topics such as free speech, kids on social media, and the role of algorithms. As we move through our discussions, please keep in mind that people have had different experiences relating to hate speech, both in person and online. Please extend to each other grace as we share our unique experiences and explore how to best address such online content. Before we begin, I want to thank each of our partners and sponsors who have placed such a high value on fostering community dialogue. This community engagement conversation is part of the United We Stand series of conversations being brought to you in partnership with the West Virginia Humanities Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Eastern West Virginia Community Foundation, and Skinner Accident and Injury Lawyers. I am also grateful for our facilitators, panelists, and moderator who are sharing their time and talents with us this evening, and our Community Engagement Committee who puts a lot of time and thought into bringing these programs to you. Finally, we are pleased to be partnering once again with the West Virginia Radio Corporation to broadcast the panel discussion portion of this evening's event live on WEPM, WCST, and online on the Panhandle News Network. Now I'll share an overview of tonight's event. As you can see, we are divided into small groups. Each group has a designated facilitator who will guide you through a small group discussion. We are asking each group to develop 1 or 2 questions that they would like to ask the panelists. We will have about 25 minutes for discussion. After the small group part of the event has concluded, Dr. Eric Wagner from the West Virginia Humanities Council will share a few remarks, and then we will move into the panel discussion with our guests, Stephen Balkam, Rita Caufield, and James Denvil. We are pleased that Marcia Kovalik will be moderating for us tonight. So thank you for joining us this evening and being willing to build a culture where we can talk about the issues that we face together. And now I'll turn it over to our facilitators to start our small group discussions. Good evening. For those who are joining us on WEPM, WCST, or the Panhandle News Network, welcome to tonight's Stubblefield Institute Community Engagement Conversation on the moderation of online hate speech. My name is Ashley Hurst, and I am the director of the Stubblefield Institute here at Shepherd University. We are broadcasting live from the Storer Ballroom, where we just concluded small group discussions. Before we move into our panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Dr. Eric Wagner from the West Virginia Humanities Council. This conversation is part of the United We Stand Connecting Through Culture initiative that was launched last year by the National Endowment for the Humanities through partnerships with state humanities councils. We are honored that Dr. Wagner and the West Virginia Humanities Council chose to partner with the Stubblefield Institute in this initiative. Dr. Wagner.
Good evening. I will be brief. My name is Eric Wagner. I'm the director of the West Virginia Humanities Council, which is the state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It has been our honor and privilege to partner for this series. I've enjoyed coming to the previous ones. We look forward to the further ones. Suffice it to say, conversation, thoughtful conversation, is, to my mind, the surest corrective for what ails us as a nation. And it is in rooms like this and spaces like this where it happens most effectively. It's very difficult to hold on to prejudices when you sit across a table from a person, even a person you may disagree heartily with on political issues. If that barrier, if those barriers and more are to be broken down, it will and it does happen in spaces like this. Thank you all for what you do, and thank you for having me here this evening.
Thank you. Now I'll briefly introduce our moderator, who will introduce our panelists and outline the panel discussion. Marcia Kovalik is the news director with the Panhandle News Network and is the co-host of Panhandle Live, which can be heard weekday mornings on WEPM and WCST. Marcia, thank you for your time tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you to all of you gathered here in the beautiful Stora Ballroom in the campus of Shepherd University. We're happy to partner once again at WVRC Media with these community conversations. We think it is very important to have these civil communications, which is Stubblefield's brand, of course. We understand that in addition to those listening in on WEPM and WCST radio, some folks are listening online from India, so we want to welcome those folks as well. And if you're just discovering us or you're listening to us on the podcast afterward, thank you for spending part of your evening with us. Our panel this evening of esteemed guests who are going to be answering some of these questions for us include, from the Family Online Safety Institute, founder Stephen Balkam. The Berkeley County NAACP Legal Redress chairperson, Rita Caufield. And partner in the privacy and cybersecurity, Hogan Lovells, James Denvil. Now, our groups have discussed some questions that they would like to give our panelists, but we're going to get started with an opening question that I'm going to give to each of the panelists. They can answer in turn, and we'll start with Mr. Balkam. And the question is, can you guys hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay. The question is, from your point of view, what is the main challenge to effectively moderating online hate speech on social media? Again, that question, from your point of view, what is the main challenge to effectively moderating online hate speech on social media?
Can I have a two-part answer?
Of course.
Thanks. The first part is the First Amendment. And it's a good thing that we have a First Amendment. I looked it up because we're in a historical town, my first time in Shepherdstown, and I absolutely love this place. Every building seems to have a plaque on it. So I looked back to see what the plaque was for the First Amendment, and it turns out it was December 15th, 1791, which is when the Bill of Rights was ratified. And included in that Bill of Rights was the First Amendment, which basically protected free speech. Now, a 233-year-old clause is what we're grappling with now in 2024 in an online environment that our framers and founders could not have begun to imagine. So no wonder we're struggling. So, First Amendment. Second is, who gets to choose? Who gets to choose whose voice is going to be heard or not on these various different platforms? Is it the platforms themselves? Is it government? Is it we, the users? Is it the United Nations, some other sort of international body? It's a really, really hard one to grapple with, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Caufield?
Well, mine's a three-part answer, actually, because what I would say is to change the incentive structures that operate in the use of social media. and that would be for the people who post, changing the ubiquitous anonymity. So changing that, somehow changing that incentive so that you can't always post exactly what you feel like posting all the time, and changing the incentive structure for the recipients, because likes, especially for young people, but I think for all adults who seem to be addicted to social media, you're addicted to that dopamine that comes from likes of things that you post. And then changing the profit incentive for the platforms, because more competition would be good, but basically the profit motive is despicable. That's all I can say. I mean, I think, well, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Denvil.
I really like this question. And I think a couple of the challenges are, well, really, it's two sides, which I think really create the major challenge. Is on the one hand, hate speech, unfortunately, is not new. I'm sure it's been around since the time human beings first started speaking. There was hate speech. And we recognize that there are certain types of hate speech that we want to moderate. And not just a couple 100-year-old, Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, but we have millennia of norms and cultural expectations and ways of moderating and calling out and regulating and maybe mitigating the impacts of hate speech. So we've got that. And then, at least I know I grew up in a place where my parents had a really good idea of what my social network was like, because there was the phone line going all the way down the hall. Before I had a car, they were driving me to see my friends. So they kind of knew who my network was. And now at a point where my two daughters, it's a very different kind of world. So the technology has changed a lot, and the incentive structures on both sides are now there. So we have sort of millennia of ways of dealing with hate speech, or we think we know how to deal with it, at least. And then this rapid, I would say over the past 30 years, technological innovation. And the challenge is, when and how do we trust our intuitions about how to regulate hate speech as being effective in this new technological age, balanced against reactionary, this is new, I fear it, I need to regulate it, and the unintended consequences of that? Do we really know enough about the new technology to regulate it in a way that's effective? And are we maybe going to be too complacent and rely on our current standings and set of norms that we have? And I think that's the challenge for us. How do we, who particularly didn't grow up with social media, start to regulate and moderate online hate?
Thank you very much. And now it's the time for our groups to shine. I have been given a mobile mic, so I get to go over to some of these groups and get their amazing questions. And we're going to start with group one, which I understand has 3 questions. So who's the spokesperson? Sir, can you just give me your first name?
Zaki.
Thank you very much for being here. And what are your questions?
All 3 of them?
Do they, if it works better to have them one at a time? One at a time.
Is social media a public space or a private space?
Okay. Do we want to start with Stephen again?
Can I say both? I mean, it obviously acts in a way like a public square, but it's privately owned. I guess the closest could be is like a shopping mall, which is a private space, but has a public feel to it. But if any time the owner of that mall wanted to shut things down or select certain people who couldn't come in to that mall, he or she could do that. I don't know if that would hold up in court, Your Honor, but that's my answer. I'll leave it at that.
Ms. Caufield?
Well, I really don't have anything to add except that it wouldn't hold up in court in some circumstances, but as far as I know, I don't know that much about it, but I would think, but at some point, shopping malls do have to allow certain activities, I think. Maybe I'm wrong.
Mr. Denvil?
I kind of like the both answer. I think particularly they can feel like public fora. They feel like the town square where people may potentially have the right to say anything, or we may view it that way, or almost like a public commodity. But also most social platforms were developed by private interests with a lot of investment behind it. So effectively, you have these private entities that have created things that at least feel like a public space. It's a public forum of a kind.
Next question from table 1.
Using the examples of France and Germany, does regulation of hate speech make them or any entity less democratic or free?
Who wants to take that? You know what? It is good that we're having a pregnant pause. Mr. Denvil, you look like you're ready to make a statement.
Well, I can say, particularly because my day-to-day life is spent working on privacy issues in particular, and just thinking in Europe, there's a very different way of looking at privacy as compared to the United States, where here we believe freedom of speech in particular is one of our fundamental rights. In Europe, particularly in France, you'll hear that privacy is a fundamental right, and there could be tensions with that. There may be certain regulations in France and Germany that will maybe implicate free speech in ways that we would not like, but they preserve privacy in ways that we may think is antithetical to the free speech rights. Freedom of speech and the way it's regulated, I think, is highly cultural, and I think it's hard to say that the French way of regulating certain types of speech or the German way of regulating certain types of speech is antithetical to democracy. It reflects a certain political history and a certain way that government entities acted against individuals that doesn't necessarily align with how our freedom of speech came out of opposing the English government at the time. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that. It's complicated.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I would just observe that I think that's one of the challenges of coming up with a global scheme for regulating the internet. We just have a lot of different governmental and cultural views.
Any other comments?
Yeah, when I travel overseas, you have to remind yourself that the First Amendment is a local ordinance. And it does not apply in the UK and in France and in Germany. And in France, and particularly in Germany, there are huge sensitivities around certain issues that are cultural and historical, and they've crafted laws related to that. Just as there are laws like the First Amendment in this country, which were crafted based on the way in which we were created as a country. So, no, God did not write the Constitution, by the way, just in case anyone was wondering. We flawed humans did based on our lived experience at that time.
You're listening to the Moderation of Online Hate Speech, a Stubblefield Institute community engagement conversation live on the Panhandle News Network. We've got our third question from Table 1.
To what extent is hate speech regulated online, and what recourse is available to victims?
Oh, they're pointing at you, Mr.
I
Denvil.
know, I see that. One way in which hate speech is regulated online is actually by the platforms. Is more and more you see platforms undertaking efforts where within their terms of use they define a certain acceptable use guidelines or acceptable conduct, and they undertake efforts either through manual review or through algorithms to identify content that violates those codes of conduct, and they may remove certain content that violates it or suspend users if they've violated that content. At the legal level, if certain online hate moves into what would be, at least in this country, in other countries it would be different levels. If it moves into unlawful conduct, such as a direct threat, or if it's a set of conduct that moves into online harassment, or it's clearly inciting imminent violence, and those are pretty narrow standards. So it's not going to be a whole lot that's going to meet that level. But if it becomes a true direct threat, if it becomes an ongoing course of harassment, if it truly is an incitement to imminent violence, then there could be legal action. It could be a criminal activity, and the government may take action there if they can identify the source of the speech, which is one of the challenges with some online speech. But the global issue that's there is I've worked with some clients who have had to take down content that was just posted by individuals who are promoting Sikh organizations because certain countries view that as a form of hate speech because it's critical of their establishment, their political establishment. So it gets taken down by the government. So again, the First Amendment does not apply there, or what their freedom of speech laws are do not align with ours. So a global approach for the online platforms to address it's you're gonna have to have different laws or different takedown requirements in the U.S. versus India versus the U.K. versus Germany, France, et cetera.
Mr. Balkam, Ms. Caufield?
Would you repeat the question?
To what extent is hate speech regulated online, and what recourse is available to victims?
Well, in terms of recourse, I mean, I think it's debatable, but I think that there should be tort law applicable, and so you don't have to worry you don't have to strictly keep yourself limited to criminal processes, but to take civil recourse. I mean, torts such as defamation or intentional infliction of emotional distress. I think that that would be a form of control.
To illustrate how strange a world we live in, 3 years ago, and by the way, full disclosure, my organization is a charitable 501c3. We have a number of companies, 34 now, as members. One of those members used to be Twitter, and I used to serve on the Trust and Safety Advisory Board for Twitter. And they had teams of trust and safety workers taking down the kinds of hate speech that James and others are talking about. Then a new owner comes along, and actually, not only does he cut 2/3 of this trust and safety team, he cut the advisory board of which I was a member, fair enough, but then begins to actually participate in the very kinds of speech that his former staff used to take down. And that is something we'd never seen before. We didn't expect an owner of a public-private space to behave in that way. And how do you then tackle that, both that behavior, but also that person? That person who, by the way, is shipping astronauts up to space for us right now and beaming satellites down. And you see what I'm saying, how complicated this can get?
And I would add, I think that case shows another way in which there is a certain kind of recourse, maybe not the kind of recourse we would always want and hope for, not as swift, but there's the recourse of leaving the platform. There's the recourse of advertisers leaving the platform. I was talking with my partner about this earlier today, just the idea, think about if you go to a restaurant that's your favorite restaurant, you go there, and after a while you start noticing people are talking in ways that you really don't like anymore. You ask the owner, hey, what's going on? I really don't like the way the conversations are going on around here anymore. The owner might say, as maybe happened in this analogy, tough, this is what I want now. This is how I want my restaurant to be. It may be sad, but you can go somewhere else. We don't have to be locked into platforms, and I think having some agency and recourse about thinking, which platforms am I on? Do they help cultivate the kind of community that I want to be a part of? And if they're not, are there other options?
Competition, that's one remedy.
We're off to a strong start here. It's the moderation of online hate speech, a Stubblefield Institute community engagement conversation. You're listening live on the Panhandle News Network. And we're going to have a bit of a twofer. We have two tables with very similar questions. So we're going to give each of those tables a chance to ask that question because I understand they're kind of thematically similar. So who's our spokesperson over here? Okay, sir, could you give us your first name?
I'm sorry, can you go to someone else first? Sure. I just got these questions and I can't read them.
Of course. Oh, I can't wait to hear from you, though. Who would like to take this one? Go ahead. Okay, first name?
My name's Bridget, and our table has kids on social media, and we have 3 questions. One of the questions has to do with, can there be ways that an age can be required to access social media? There's a Child Online Protection Act that one of the members of our group said the age is 13. And so the group is wondering, should that age of protection go up above 13, and to what age? For example, you can't get a driver's license until 16 because we've deemed that driving a car before that age is dangerous. You can't have alcohol before the age of 21. So should the age of protection for social media go up above 13? And if so, how would that be verified? So if you have a user sitting at the computer and they are not the age that is determined to be safe for that social media platform, how does that age get verified?
Okay, so table 4, is your question very similar to that? Okay, all right, let me just come to you then.
Well,
It's the exact same, okay. All right, perfect. So, who wants to take this one?
I'll have a stab. So
Mr. Balkam.
let's start with COPPA, the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, which goes back to the previous century, actually, speaking of history, 1998. And it was originally, it's actually a privacy law. It's not an online safety law, which people often get confused about. It's basically the age with which, below that age, you must get parental permission to market, take information, personal details from kids, and so on and so forth. But it has become the de facto time and space or age that you can go onto social media. Now, again, that law was passed, and that law was passed before Facebook even existed. So there was no research done, there was no analysis about what was the appropriate time or age for children to get on. One thing, and I'll get to age verification in a minute, but one of the issues, and I know there are a number of people who are advocating the raising of the age to 16, there is a little bit of the genie's out of the bottle issue here. I just want you to consider for a moment a little thought experiment about going after not just hundreds, not thousands, millions of 14 and 15-year-olds, and 13-year-olds for that matter, who are already on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and saying, no, I'm sorry, we're going to take away your free speech and your ability to gather. And in other words, you have no rights now until you hit the age of 16. And just let that sit there. Do teenagers have rights? That's a big question, which, by the way, in Europe, they would resoundingly say yes. We have a tendency to talk about parental rights, not so much kids' rights. So let's just let that sit there for a minute. The holy grail, as we were talking earlier in the table, is age verification, age assurance. How do we tell that this person is 12 or 14 or 15 or 17 or 17 or 19? In other words, the 13, 16, 18 barriers that exist online, and in some cases the real world that you were just describing. And for 2 decades, I and a whole lot of people have been looking into this, and we keep saying the technology isn't there yet. The technology is there if you don't mind being privacy invasive. The more effective your age assurance or age verification, the more invasive it is. It takes more information, et cetera, et cetera. However, there are signs, glimmers of hope and I saw a demonstration at Google in Dublin just 2 weeks ago of a software that they're now using that just takes a very quick picture of you, your face, and analyzes your age to within very small margins of error, and immediately destroys that picture. So it's not stored, there's nothing attached, there's no database, it doesn't go anywhere, it stays on the phone, and then is destroyed and is deleted. So I think we're getting much, much closer to a place where we can finally say, whatever age we agree on, we'll then have a better way of determining who is what age.
Ms. Caufield or Mr. Denvil?
Well, excuse me, I wouldn't add anything, have nothing to add as far as the technological aspect of that question, verifying age. I think it's definitely a matter of huge concern. But I would like to advocate for, yes, raising the age, also limiting use of social media by people even when their ages are appropriate. In getting ready for this panel, I interviewed a lot of our local school staff, principals, superintendents. Everyone to a person felt like social media was a scourge. It's just horrible. It has made teachers' lives miserable. The administrators are working with these problems all the time. So of course that's a huge concern. It's like, well, if this thing is so bad for the schools, maybe we just ought to eliminate it. And as far as taking away rights, that sounds kind of familiar. Some of us have recently had some rights taken away. And also think about the tobacco settlement situation. If you think it's impossible, think how our culture has changed in the ways we've handled child safety and tobacco use. I mean, huge societal changes can be made with the appropriate, whatever, approach. But I do think that social media, we need to recognize that it is, by many, many people, especially educators, considered a very negative influence on our children, and it needs to be curtailed. And if raising the age limit is a step in that direction, yeah, let's do it.
Mr. Denvil?
A number of states are actually starting to look at these ideas, raising the age, and COPPA 2.0 is now being considered to raise some protections a little bit. So there's some movements in that direction. One thing to consider is there's a fairly long-standing jurisprudence at constitutional level that even age gating for pornography is a violation of the First Amendment because it's protected speech in some circumstances. So there, the Supreme Court has ruled that certain types of age gating, even for pornography, is unconstitutional. So there may be an uphill challenge. Again, I don't think that is, as you were just pointing out, the law does change, Supreme Court decisions do change. That may not be an argument against pushing for those laws and advocating for them. But I also think, I'm not sure we should always outsource some of these mitigators to the government. And having had the fight with young teenagers who really wanted to be on social media or have a cell phone, I think the first line of defense is parents. I don't think we should put all of the onus on parents, but parents need to have those tough conversations about when do you get your iPhone or your smartphone? When are you actually allowed to have that social media? How much access do I have? I mean, those are not easy conversations with a teenager because they're, of course, going to rebel against it. But I'm not sure that always legislation is the best first step, although it may be needed. It's going to be an uphill battle there. But I also think educating parents and children alike about what appropriate use should be and how parents should have insight into social media, just like my parents knew who I was on the phone with, I think is a useful way to address it.
You're listening to the Stubblefield Institute Community Engagement Conversation, moderation of online hate speech. We're going to hit one more question from table 4 before we go back to table 2.
I just want to, could I just quickly challenge something here in a very civil way?
That's the name of the game here.
I hear the cigarette analogy a lot, and Facebook is just the same as the tobacco industry. I'm not a huge fan of Facebook, but I don't think that equating something which is a physical substance going into your lungs, which there is no one on this planet, I don't think, would be a good thing for anyone under the age of 18, never mind over 18, to do. If we are now equating that, and we then say, well, in which case social media is the same as tobacco, it is nothing but evil, it is nothing but wrong, it's nothing but bad, we wouldn't have a Greta Thunberg. And, she would not have been allowed onto social media to campaign for climate change in the way in which she did. She started at the age of 15. Various activists in Afghanistan. I mean, the list goes on. There are a lot of good things as well as bad things, but there are a lot of good things on social media. And I think just simply taking that away from our kids, I think would be problematic.
So regarding the addictive nature of social media, which, there are algorithms that get kids hooked, the analogy to tobacco might fit that.
If you talk to clinical psychologists, and I talk to a lot of them, they tend not to use the A word because addiction has very, very strict definitions when it comes to alcohol, tobacco, drugs, etc. Typically physical substances that you literally cannot live without, cannot get through the day with. There's a psychologist at Harvard, what's his name? I'll email it to you. But he describes it as problematic online use. And that's a different way of framing it. The problem comes in the overuse and the heavy use, but doesn't mean that simply going online is in itself a bad thing.
But it can be a very bad thing. Suicide statistics are going up. We, as a state, are 10th in the country anyway with our suicide rates, and they have increased since, with the most recent numbers. They haven't gone down. They keep going up. And let's see. I don't think that you can get away from the tobacco analogy simply by saying it's a physical thing. I mean, the mental illnesses that are the anorexia epidemic. We have almost an epidemic of anorexia and kids concerned with their body image. These are very unhealthy things, and I think that they need to be. I think they need to be curtailed, and we need to use whatever is available to do it.
What a good, healthy conversation we're having. Anyone else? All right. Table 4. State your first name, please.
I'm John. What it would be the best regulatory regime for us in this country to establish, to have the best way of keeping children from being harmed by and on social media. And I say that in this country because we've got 50 states, we've got a federal government, and at the moment, there's more than one federal agency involved in this in one way or another. So for each of you, which would be the best regulatory regime you can think of?
Who wants to take that first?
I defer to my lawyer.
Oh, okay, Mr. Denvil. You've been voluntold.
I'm not ready to identify what that ideal one was, so I'm copping out a little bit here.
That's fair.
Well, yeah, I'll still cop out. I think the key way to get there is actually through discussions like this and conversations like this. I think if we stay on two-dimensional screens and ranting about the best way to regulate without having these conversations, I think they should be intergenerational. I think they should be diverse. I think they should be, representatives from all different groups to talk about these issues. Because I think at the moment, honestly, it would be a fair bit of hubris for me to come out and say, I know how to regulate this. Because I think there are extraordinary benefits from social media. It has connected communities that have tended to be isolated and maybe suffered and struggled in ways. It has uncovered abuses. It has also led to horrible bouts, an epidemic of anorexia and other issues. So it's got extraordinary problems and extraordinary benefits. And I think I would like some regulatory humility and more discussions where we really start identifying what are the harms, what's the cause of the harms, who's the best able to address those harms, whether it be the platform operators, they're going to have a role. The people who are posting certainly should be held accountable. Also parents and educating the children, educating all users. So that's a cop-out answer, but I think we need to have a process first before we identify the ideal regulation.
Mr. Balkam.
I'll give it a shot. I think we start with looking overseas where they have been relatively successful in creating these regimes. I'm fairly familiar with the UK, with Europe, and Australia. And in each case, they began with multi-year research projects funded by their own federal government to actually go out and find out what is really going on. What are the risks? What are the harms? Oh, and by the way, what are the benefits? Not just of social media, but our online lives. And based on that research, they then crafted, or actually started to hold hearings. And they held hearings not like our recent one where we paraded in the CEOs and berated them with, you have blood on your hands. That kind of rhetoric does not get you to a good regulatory regime. It's great theater. It might raise money for your campaign, but it doesn't get you to where we want to get to. I would then humbly suggest that the United States passes a federal privacy bill that finally tells us and tells the companies what they can collect, what they can store, and what they can pass on of our data. That's number one. Number two, then on top of that, you can build an online safety set of regulations, some of which the Kids Online Safety Act and some of the other ones, we have some, the age-appropriate design code that's currently law in California, we have a lot of sympathy with. But the problem is that we haven't done our research. We don't seem to govern very well at the federal level. We don't seem to just do the ordinary grunt work of crafting legislation, sending it out. The Brits took 6 years to create the Online Safety Act, which is now the Online Safety Bill. Oh, and by the way, they have a regulatory organization called Ofcom that they built up staffing levels over a number of years so they could be ready on day one to regulate that. They also at their, well, let me put it to you this way. We came up with a proposal to the transition team for the Obama administration. Do you remember that administration? For a chief online safety officer for the United States. Someone who could, at the White House level, coordinate the 6, 7, 8 different agencies that are involved in this topic so that there was a coherent, one direction, joined up government to deal with this problem. We still don't have that. We still don't have any kind of strong sense as a country where we want to go. And now what's happening is that California and Texas and Florida and Utah and all of these individual states are creating different and varying kinds of pieces of legislation, which, quite frankly, is going to be a mess for us to navigate in the years to come.
Anyone else have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I didn't want to give the impression that I am not aware of the huge, wonderful benefits of social media and the internet. In the course of doing these interviews with people in the community, I heard many times school officials too, even though it's such a headache for them, several people commented about, one person commented, I have in my pocket more knowledge than all of my ancestors had throughout their lives. And my son-in-law told me he thinks he has gotten a better education from the internet than he got in 4 years at Vanderbilt. So, I mean, you know, there are plenty of wonderful benefits, but in terms of addressing, in terms of the question posed, I would say, I was reading about the Kids Online Safety Act as proposed, as initially drafted. I think they were talking about states' attorney generals doing the enforcement, and that generated some objection because there would be so many different kinds of interpretations and the different political philosophies, and so it was suggested that then enforcement would be at the federal level. I don't think the COSA, Kids Online Safety Act, as it's presently drafted, would meet Steve's suggestions as far as the privacy.
It's definitely problematic, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
we need the privacy bill first.
Yeah, and then the Kids Online Safety Act, but it is something that's been put before the Congress for at least a couple of different sessions, so there's something pending.
You're tuned in to the Stubblefield Institute Community Engagement Conversation, the topic, moderation of online hate speech, and we have made our way back to table 2.
The two largest social media companies are well known, and they've got well known heads at the top of them, very public people at the top of those. And the question is, can the owners of social media companies be held responsible for bad actors on social media?
Thank you, sir. Who wants to take that? Mr. Denvil?
Yeah, apparently as legal counsel, I am now called on to do this. So again, this is not legal advice. However, so there, in this country, partially to foster the growth of the internet, we had the Communications Decency Act, and Section 230 was designed to effectively provide immunity for internet operators, because we didn't want public forums or publicly available forums for the people who provide those to be held responsible for everything and anything that somebody says on them. So the mere fact that somebody gets online on, whether it's on Facebook or TikTok or YouTube, name your favorite, and posts something that is legally actionable, it should be that person who uttered it, who posted it, who should be held responsible. We also sort of agree with that. Section 230, which has started to become under, attack from certain sides, but is still established law, establishes that no, the operator is not liable for that. They're also allowed to curate and engage in editorial actions. So, Twitter, or X as it's now called, or Facebook, they can take down content, but they're not going to be liable for that because you're allowed to create the form that you would like to create. But you're not going to be held liable for the specific content that people put out there, at least not under the Communications Decency Act, which is fairly well established now. There's a lot of challenges coming at that, and plaintiffs' attorneys are trying to figure out their ways to get around some of those protections, but it's pretty darn well established now under US law. And if the point of social media is to create a platform and democratize speech and democratize the transmission of content in ways so that we can all connect, I think it may be a bit misguided to try to hold the platform operators liable, because on YouTube, it's 3.7 million videos uploaded every day. And if they now have to go through and are going to be held liable, even if it's not strict liability, but whatever that liability is, it's going to create some kind of funnel, some kind of friction that's going to create, YouTube will not operate as it could anymore. And yes, maybe we can say, well, we'll have AI, algorithms will do it. AI and algorithms are not necessarily going to be able to keep up to date with everything, and people will, evolve their hate speech, as we've seen, particularly like, certain hate groups do. As certain content gets identified as being hateful content that's harmful, they'll evolve and just start using new symbols, new terminology. I mean, there are certain terms that I grew up with, like, growing up in the 80s in high school, the word queer was an absolute horrible insult. According to, certain of my friends, that was not something to be said. Now it's become a term that's become embraced and used as a positive term. So as the algorithms will have to keep up with that, and algorithms are probably not going to be perfect, at least not today. And having manual review, there's also costs to that. So I think there may be unintended consequences of holding the platform operators liable. However, I also think there is a lot of room to encourage platform operators to be responsible and to take down content that's harmful. And we've seen that have more and more effect. And I know Stephen in particular can talk to that and the work he's done with the platforms to take content down.
Mr. Balkam?
Well, yeah, we should look north to Canada. They have a really interesting and intriguing online safety bill that they've just come up with. They're actually talking about life imprisonment for CEOs of some of these social media companies. Now, it's got the headlines because can you imagine Mark Zuckerberg in prison for the rest of his life? No. Keep it civil, keep it civil. Now, my guess is that they will probably walk that back when it finally gets through the Parliament. In the UK, there's also a notion of imprisoning CEOs of companies, and not surprisingly, a number of those CEOs are no longer landing at Heathrow. They're flying over the country, so it can have some adverse effects too. I just think that we should be careful about how far we go in this. Government does need to get its act together to create a level playing field and the rules of the road, and then the companies are going to just have to adhere to what probably were open roads before, where there were no speed limits and where they're going to have to slow it down.
And I think it's important to mention that there are some large class action suits already underway against the platforms. There was multi-state litigation begun in Northern California a few years back against Meta. And within the last year or two, there's been a class action suit initiated against all of the major platforms, TikTok and Meta, et cetera. And West Virginia signed on as one of the plaintiffs in that particular case. But I noticed in the complaint that West Virginia did not ask for an actual relief. There were 27 or 30 states, and among those 3 states, including West Virginia, did not have a prayer for relief, although the general prayer for relief was okay, but there was just something funny about the fact that we didn't ask for our specific, maybe we don't have what Patrick Morrissey regarded as a relevant statute that had been violated, but at any rate, we are involved. West Virginia is part of the effort.
Mr. Denvil?
Yeah, Also, just listening to this, just one of the things I think we should also step back and just remember, it's easy, I think, if we're all sitting here and talking about hate speech, and we just say hate speech is wrong, and we've all just sort of got our own ideas maybe in our head of what hate speech is. And if we start calling for personal liability for the people who are not even uttering it, but just allowing it to be said, once it gets down to, okay, let's define hate speech. What exactly is hate speech? What are we going to put the hate speech label on? There may even be some differences on this room, maybe even up on this table, maybe minor differences, maybe large differences. But our First Amendment is based on the idea is just remember, whatever you think is the right way to regulate speech, you're not always going to be in power. And maybe at some point there will be an administration, there will be an attorney general, there will be courts that may be more open to thinking that what you think is fundamental advocacy of human rights as being a form of hate speech. So however we're going to sort of regulate and enforce hate speech, I think it's worthwhile taking some of the humility to just remember why we have the First Amendment where it is, because of just remembering that we do have changes of administrations, and what you may think as a fundamental freedom of speech right may be viewed as hate speech. And that's a little bit of an extreme example, but it's the type of slippery slope that the Supreme Court justices have often looked at when addressing freedom of speech issues.
You're tuned in to the Stubblefield Institute Community Engagement Conversation. The topic tonight, the moderation of online hate speech, and we have made our way to table 3.
Hi. Our topic was algorithms and online communities. The question is, what is the role of algorithms in moderating hate speech in online communities?
Who wants to take that?
Well, first of all, how are you defining an algorithm?
Well, that's our question. But we did talk about, in just the knowledge that we had at the table, as a coding system that is developed and released to provide information to people based on information that they're seeking, and then it comes back to, oh, this is what you're interested in, then we're going to provide you this information whether you asked for it or not. But it's complicated, and can an algorithm moderate anything, I guess would be the question. So is there anything in the release of or the use of an algorithm that could somehow alert or inform if hate speech is being activated?
Yes, as well as AI systems, as artificial intelligence systems, and so on. There's a lot of that's already being utilized by all of the major social media platforms, so that it doesn't require humans to physically go and look at every post. A lot of stuff gets thrown up when certain words, certain phrases are used and flagged for humans to review, although I believe there are some, and particularly with child sexual abuse material, stuff is deleted without humans having to intervene and see it. So yes, algorithms, but of course algorithms are created by humans for now. For now. Gen AI is taking off, and we're hurtling towards AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, which then all bets are off. But for now, we do have developers who are creating these that can then check, delete, and or flag, depending on. So I guess yes is the simple answer to your question.
So we had a follow-up question also. What role do algorithms have or play in promoting some of this hate speech? Fomenting it. So you can answer either the original question or also color it in those terms as well. Anyone? Mr. Denvil? Ms. Caufield?
I think this part of the problem why we're all here tonight is that algorithms and the platforms have done this, whether intentionally or not. Working with these companies, it's clear to me that they are looking for users, increase the users, and increase the engagement. All the other stuff, the trash, we have some staff to take the trash out. But what we really want to know is to keep the users, keep getting new users and keep them engaged. And one of the ways you keep people engaged on platforms is by giving them, through algorithms, delivering to them more and more extreme content. Now, they claim, YouTube, Instagram, the whole range of them, claim that they are, recalibrating, resetting their systems so that they're not delivering that. But test after test shows that maybe they're not winning the battle internally with the folks who want to continue to get more engagement on the platform. I'm not quite sure if I answered the question.
Anyone else?
I think, of course, there's algorithms for these companies. They're private companies. They're trying to make money and keep people employed. So, of course, they're trying to keep people on because they're fueled by advertising. But traditional media does that too. If you look, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, pick your favorite one. There's going to be a red line at the bottom trying to tell you that there's some, breaking news, even if the breaking news is just that they gave you breaking news 10 minutes ago. So there's always, when you have for-profit media outlets, they want your attention. So whether it's going to be algorithms or graphic designers, they're going to get your attention. We've been living with this for a while. So this is new, but I think if you educate people that, yes, these feeds are driven by algorithms to keep your attention on it, and to remember we have agency. I can turn off my TV. I can put down my smartphone. Now that is, me at my age, that's an easier thing than perhaps a 13 or 14-year-old kid or a 12-year-old, 9-year-old kid who's on social media. But parents also have a responsibility, I think, to educate kids about, yes, you're feeling drawn into this. There's reasons why. No, the red line doesn't always mean there's some emergency that they're talking about on TV. But educate people about how these systems are operating so they can exert some agency and decide when and where and whether to engage.
Well, referring back to the previous question about government involvement, I would just say that seems to me to be a perfect role for the government, is to educate people with respect to that, and also to provide content that would be not geared toward appealing to the largest number of people, but content that is efficacious.
Mr. Balkam.
Just like the National Institute for the Arts supports.
Yeah, James, you just said a word that I guess is the elephant in the room, and that's advertising. Back in the mid-'90s, when the web first came out, there were I guess the original sin of the World Wide Web was advertising. We had a choice to go the subscriber route or the advertising route. Subscribing, like Netflix and others, you pay your money and you get some stuff. Or how about free stuff, and we'll just serve you up ads? And everyone said, let's do the free stuff. Now, the problem was, to do that and to make money, you had to get better and better at targeting your ads towards these users, which means collecting more and more of their information without necessarily their knowledge, unless you read the 13-page privacy notice. And I think that if there is any way or an effort we could get back to, again, genie's out of the bottle, but the advertising model as what has led us to this, I'm afraid.
Anyone else? So our conversation tonight is the moderation of online hate speech. We have gone through all of the questions posed by the tables, but we might have time for one or two individual questions. Sir, I saw your hand. Mike?
Yes, Mike. I had actually a couple of questions. So I think the difference between what Facebook does with an algorithm and what Fox News does in your television is that Fox News isn't interactive. And so it's not collecting data from you as you click on something, and it leads you to more and more extreme videos or content in the same vein. So to use the analogy of the tobacco, is the algorithm not the nicotine in the cigarette, which leads one to continue this behavior. And then to go back to close to the beginning and the discussion of age verification, and we've mentioned AI a couple of times, what will be the effect of the ability of younger and younger people to appear older and older and older using technology, and they're going to be able to pretty easily get past even an instantaneous photo, and what do we do about that?
Who wants to take that, Mr.
I mean,
Balkam?
I'll start with the second question. It does require a real face, and believe it or not, the technology can detect whether you're a real face or not. But no doubt, it's an arms race. Let's face it. And I'm sure some enterprising 11-year-old is working on it right now.
Anyone else on the panel want to take that? Great. Another question from the audience. Yes, sir. Your name?
My name is Richard, and I have a question for James. You mentioned your daughters. How old are they now, and when did they get their first iPhones? And when do you think my 9-year-old granddaughter is going to be ready for hers?
So for the sake of my daughter's privacy, I won't reveal when they got theirs. I think it's a decision. I mean, I know people who I trust and value and respect who let their kids have phones well before my kids had them. I also know people who let their kids have phones well after. And I probably wish that I had made them wait longer to receive them, because I think there's a whole lot that happens on social media, and it's an extraordinary challenge, I think, to monitor it and police it and parent it. And it takes a lot of resources to do. I think particularly as we've all been out to restaurants and you see the whole family looking at their screens, it's very easy to fall into the trap of letting the screen supervise your child. So I'm not sure what the right age is, and I don't think there probably is the right age. And I think there are probably some 9-year-olds who probably should have some form of device, though I probably don't think access to every single app that's out there. I also think that there are some teenagers who probably still need to wait a little bit before they should be able to use it. I think that's a child by child, parent by parent, particularly because cultural differences and the like. I'm not sure that I would feel comfortable giving a one right answer on that.
Anyone else on the panel want to take that?
Sure, I would like to refer you to somebody has a blog called Wait Until 8th, which is, it's a former school teacher, and he, obviously from the title of the blog, is interested in keeping people from getting onto social media at too young an age. And on that blog, he posted an essay, a story that Principal Lyons from Hedgesville High School referred me to. And it is a heartbreaking story comparing the life of a middle school 12-year-old boy in 2010 versus, or maybe it was 2008 versus 2018. So in the 10 years, what a day in the life of this kid is in 2010 and what his life is like in 2018. It's hell. I would not want any child to have to live that life. And this is the life that our kids are living. It's hard to conceive until you actually read the details of how this child's day goes. But, he spills something on himself in the cafeteria. Well, 10 years ago, or not 10 years ago, but in 2010, big deal. He goes in, he gets his gym shorts, and he puts on his gym shorts, and a few people notice, and it's no big deal. And he goes home, and he basically doesn't have much interaction with school for the rest of the evening and next morning. He's just an ordinary kid who thinks a little bit about the people around him. He's just starting to get interested in, how he appears to the rest of the world. But in 2018, there's some kids watching him slip. They've been, waiting and watching this kid slip, and somebody takes a video, they get it out there right away on Snapchat. They profit by getting a lot of likes. This kid who's taken the photograph is getting a lot of likes on his social media account. And meanwhile, the kid who's got the soup spilled on him, he goes and changes into his gym shorts, but now it's a big deal. Now he goes back to class and somebody takes a picture of him in his gym shorts. And when he goes back home later in the day, his sisters are embarrassed because it's been all over the media. It's like he can't escape. And the story ends at 3 o'clock in the morning where the kid, the 8th grader who took the picture, is smiling and feeling good about the great day he's had on social media, and this other kid is suffering. I mean, it makes you realize what this has done to our children, and no wonder we have a mental health crisis. Every person I talked to said we don't have enough social workers and counselors in the schools.
Anyone else on the Mr. Balkam?
I'm also a big supporter of wait until eighth grade, in other words, to get a phone. And there is a wonderful watch called the Gizmo, which allows a kid under that age to phone home, to text home, and vice versa. And it's a GPS tracker and has some other games. It looks like an iWatch. It costs a tenth of the price. But that's all that a kid certainly an elementary kid needs, and certainly your 9-year-old granddaughter does not need a supercomputer that has more power than took the man to the moon back in 1969. There is enormous pressure on kids, and therefore on their parents, to get the latest phones or whatever. The part of what the Wait Until 8th project is about is getting all of the 5th grade families, 6th grade families, 7th grade, whatever, and saying we will not, collectively, we will not get phones for our kids, and therefore there won't be pressure on on the friends and so on until they get to 8th grade or they go to high school. So look into it. I think it's a really good idea.
And I think there's so much benefit in teaching kids the patience to wait until they can get these devices, but also once you have the device, establishing routines around putting it aside, because I have some close friends who are college professors, and the amount of time, particularly as they're now seeing students who are not able to put aside a device for a 45-minute class. They're unable to live for 45 minutes without staring at a screen and seeing whether they're getting a like or some kind of response. And whether the grid's going to go down or just an app server is going to go down, at some point you're going to be without your device. So just teaching our kids, giving them the resources to learn to deny themselves that dopamine hit from the device for a little bit, for maybe at least until 8th grade. And then even after 8th grade, teaching them, like, you've now got to put it down for 2 hours, go outside. Something is going to be helpful for their mental well-being.
If you're listening to the Panhandle News Network on your phone, don't put it down yet. We've got about another 10 minutes. Time for another question or two. I saw your hand first.
Just adding to the 8th grade, wait until 8. My husband actually teaches 8th grade science, and 8th grade's a little too early. The kids set up fights at school, and then they have 30 kids gathering to get it on Snapchat, to get the best view of the fight. I mean, talk about hatred. This is just, it's happening with 8th graders in schools, and I know it's happening with so I don't think just waiting till 8 is going to be enough. It has to be a lot of other.
I totally agree.
All right, I saw another hand.
Thank you. Thank you. My name's Susan, and thank you for being here this evening. I probably should pose this as a question. When we mention hate speech, it's just kind of a thing hanging out there. And I'm wondering, wouldn't it be more effective to talk about hate speech in relationship to particularly children who are on the receiving end of it? Hate speech doesn't happen in isolation. It's directed to others, and it's the others who have to cope with it. So it seems to me that in those circumstances, it wouldn't be so difficult to figure out what hate speech is. Does that make sense?
Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Well, my opinion is that hate speech is, we have in this part of the country, but I think probably many parts of this country, a perfect example of hate speech is the use of the N-word. And we have that going on a lot around here. And if you want to know what hate speech is, and that's, I would definitely.
So we have the
put
West
that out
Virginia
there.
State Code. Allison just handed it to me. It states that all persons within the boundaries of the state of West Virginia have the right to be free from any violence or intimidation by threat of violence committed against their persons or property because of their race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, political affiliation, or sex. End quote. Any? Hate crime, I'm sorry. Oh, hate crime at the federal level, a crime motivated by bias against race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. Sure. We have a follow-up question.
Yeah, no, I don't think I was clear enough. I'm not talking about the words like the word you mentioned. I'm talking about hate speech becomes hate speech when it has a devastating effect on the receiver. So it doesn't have to be a bad word. It can just be everyday hearing, you're so fat, you're so ugly, go bury your head in the sand. And that child ends up cutting herself, killing herself. To me, that the negative consequences make it obvious that that child has been the recipient of hateful speech that has terrible consequences. That's what I mean. Like, how can it be so difficult to figure it out when, you know, if an algorithm notices little Billy has, you know, wet pants from the cafeteria and some kids posted it with a joke, why can't that algorithm take those snapshots off? Because to me, that's hate behavior.
Right.
It's just bullying. And that's what I'm saying. To me, it's like, this is not rocket science to me. So, you know, I think most people in this group are very conscious people and probably intellectual people, but it doesn't take high-level thinking to get down and make some of these connections in order to protect children. And you may have statistics on how many, what's the suicide rate been, how has it expanded since kids have been on social media? How many kids have killed themselves because of bullying, just for example, or committed, you know, terrible crimes, right?
I certainly don't have a definitive answer, but I can tell you that when I spoke with Superintendent Bishop here in Jefferson County, he told me that I confirmed with him that he had said this. In October, he was giving a speech or something, and he mentioned that this was on October the 23rd, was the news release. At that time, there had been 3 suicides of students in this school district, and that was only October for this school year. So it's incredible.
A follow-up question that I received and was encouraged to ask was, you know, what rights do victims of hate speech have currently, or could they have, or should they have?
On most platforms, there's the ability to report content. I would encourage everyone to learn, whatever platform it is you're using or your loved ones are using, learn how to report content on it. So, that's not always going to be effective, but it should be effective. And so figure out, how do you report content? Counter speech can be an effective means of combating hate speech at times. Sometimes it's challenging, but I certainly would say it's not just agency for those of us who are, what are we going to post? But if you see something, say something. That's not just a national security issue, but I think if we see online hate speech, we should call it out for what it is, even if we're not the targets of it. I think particularly for those of us who are not the targets of it, it's probably even more important to call it out. And whether it's just flagging it to report for the platform to do something, or to post something that shows that you don't find that content acceptable, I think those are the types of recourse. And then, if it's passing certain lines, you know, consider whether civil liability or maybe even criminal liability may be a recourse.
Anyone else on the panel? We do have another question. This may be our last one, sir.
Yeah, hi. This is a tricky one for me because shouldn't we be concerned that, in fact, speech is not a protected right? The First Amendment only says that Congress shall not make any laws restricting it. And so it is not a protected right, but shouldn't the victims of speech be protected by that agency?
Who'd like to take that one? Mr. Denvil?
So speech is not a fundamental right in that I can be fired for what I say. Facebook can kick me off their platform for what I say, and that's not a violation of my freedom of speech. If the government imprisons me for what I say, or if they fine me or take some adverse action against me, that could be, depending on what it is. So that's where the issue is, and you can take action against people for certain types of speech if they defame you, if they say something that's, you know, a lie and they should have known and they're publicizing that. Defamation, liable, if it's a threat, if it's intimidation, if it's harassment, there is recourse, and people don't have a right to engage in that kind of speech. And they don't have a right to be on a social media platform. If you report certain content, the platform could decide to take them down. So in those instances, I definitely agree that there's not some fundamental speech right such that people get to say anything and everything that they want. In private forum, including social media, they don't. And the platforms can take action. And I think we're going to see the Supreme Court actually uphold that again based on the hearings that we recently saw.
Mr. Balkam?
I'll defer on this particular question. I do want to return to the 7-year-old and the phone and all the talk that came out of that and the problematic use that our kids have and the rules that James was, and we've had the same with our daughter and so on. But just by the way, folks, we need to curb our own use of technology. Kids do what we do, not what we tell them to do. So, I say to parents when I do parents' evenings in schools, do you use your phone as an alarm clock? And they'll go, yeah. I said, don't. Because what's the last thing you're going to look at last thing at night? What's the first thing you're going to do before you've even brushed your teeth? And if you have young kids, you know how they love to jump on the bed and they see that blue glow on your face. They're going to want the same thing. When I work with kids, the kids say to me, their number one complaint is, my parents don't give me much attention. I can't get my mom's attention. She's always on Facebook. Dad's always checking his email at dinner. So we need to be good digital role models ourselves to our own kids. So, sorry, end of PSA.
Ms. Caufield?
Yeah, I would like to say also on that subject, I'm sorry, just forgot what I was going to say. But the Wait Until 8th guy who did the essay about the 8th grader, he has a list of 5 things that we can do, and that's what reminded me, his suggestion that we all get ourselves together on this. And I think it's important, especially a couple of these points. One is propose that administrators and teachers stop using social media for a school-related purpose. Don't use social media. I haven't been on Facebook for a long time, and I don't like it when community groups schedule stuff and they say, get the information on Facebook. A lot of us are not using Facebook. That normalizes it to these children at a young age. They don't need to be normalized so much. So I'll leave the rest of the suggestions. But anyway, I thought that was an important one.
Wow. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to this great group of folks at these wonderful tables for these amazing questions.